Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Sharifa Yasmin's play The Devils Between Us, which I'm reading out of the Methuen Drama Book of Trans Plays. I actually think this is an incredible play. So far, I've read 1, 2, 3, 4. This is my 5th play out of this collection. I think for me, this one is the best of the 5 that I've read, but I also just think it's one of the best plays that I've ever read. I think it's so beautifully written and so challenging and so fascinatingly complex. I think this is an absolutely amazing play. I want to read more stuff by Yasmin, because it's so good. And actually, I think as somebody who, at time of filming, is currently in a theater production, directing a theater production, that the brilliance of this play actually starts even from before the opening, because there's a number of bits and pieces here at the beginning, this preparatory material. We've got the character list, but then we've got casting policy that says Latifa must be played by a trans woman of color. Latifa Mubarak is a trans Arab woman, late 20s, Muslim. No exceptions. Great protections need to be put in place to ensure the actress playing this role is not harmed by the transphobic content that is said to her. I think that caution is really, really good, because, I mean, one of the things with many trans plays, at least from the ones that I've seen in this collection and others that I've read, transphobia, homophobia tends to be very common in them. And if, as a director or a playwright, you want trans actors cast, which I think is really important ethically, there is the potential that may trigger real world suffering for people who have been victims of transphobia, transphobic violence in many cases, etc., etc. There's also a content warning about anti-trans, anti-LGBT rhetoric in the play, and Yasmin wants that warning transmitted to audiences, because again, it can be damaging to people. There's a statement here about transphobia. So Yasmin has written, as a trans writer, it was important that the story reflected the very real moments that TGNC, that's transgender and gender nonconforming people, face all over this country, and more importantly, confronting how problematic those moments are. Dealing with the transphobia in the play is not about the other characters politely learning to respect Latifa. It is about them being confronted for that behavior and being held accountable. And I think as a sort of statement of social purpose, that's really, really important to clearly define what is meant to occur here. There's also an intimacy caution here. Yasmin strongly advises an intimacy coordinator, and as I understand it, I think in addition to being a playwright, a director, and an actor, Yasmin has also worked as an intimacy coordinator. So that's going to be something that she's very aware of. And then the other one that's interesting to me, because all of that makes sense. This is a play with some pretty significant and painful transphobia and homophobia and violence directed at LGBT people. But the other note that she puts at the beginning is about accents, because this is set in South Carolina. And she says here, strong Southern accents tend to immediately bring along a lot of cliches about the South. Many in South Carolina do not have an accent, and it's more reflective of rural areas. If one is going to be attempted, it should be a soft hint at the end of a word, a very light twang. And so I think that's really, really interesting, because it makes sort of intuitive, obvious sense to put in cautions about transphobia and homophobia and violence. But to think even at the level of there are negative stereotypes of Southerners, of people with Southern accents, Appalachian accents, etc., and we don't want those negative stereotypes. I think that's really, really insightful. Like, I love that Yasmin was even thinking on that level of, like, in the same way that there are harmful stereotypes, not the same way, but in comparable ways that there are harmful stereotypes of queer people, there are also harmful stereotypes of Southerners and of people from Appalachia and so on and so on. And sort of confronting those social prejudices across the board, I think is really, really good. So the actual play itself, we have George Craver, who is a cis white man in his late 20s. He's the owner of an auto garage, according to the character descriptions. He is also a closeted gay man. He has very, very much internalized an extremely violent homophobia from his brutally abusive father. We have Hunter Gabriel, described as a cis man, any ethnicity, early 30s, the town coroner. He's in love with George. They have these moments where they're clearly, like, Hunter is trying to make it okay for George to feel like he can, to feel the way he feels, to accept their love, their mutual attraction for one another. And Hunter is consistently pushed away by George. Then there's Barb Craver, cis white woman, 60s, George's aunt by marriage. She's this sort of interesting ethical center in a way. She pretty much immediately accepts Latifa. So Latifa Mubarak, trans Arab woman, late 20s Muslim, according to the stage directions. She had grown up as Latif Mubarak. When her father found out that she was gay, which was what she first come out as, he kicked her out of the house. She had gone to George. So George was her best friend in elementary school, high school, stuff like this. George helped protect Latif from anti-Arab prejudice, from anti-immigrant prejudice, as well as, because Latif had been very effeminate. So George helped protect Latif from that sort of homophobic abuse. George and Latif had been, they had been in love. I mean, they had been in this sort of deep, beautiful, teenage type love, right? And I don't mean to, like, dismiss it or downplay it, because it is, I mean, the way that Yasmin expresses this affection they have for each other is incredibly beautiful. There's a bit that I marked. Let me see if I can find it. They had this deep romance where, okay, I've found it here. Yeah. So this is kind of a lengthy bit of dialogue, but I think it's beautiful. I don't know. I love it. So George, this is somewhat late in the play. George feels really just shattered. He's sort of just come to terms with how incredibly violent and abusive his father was, particularly as far as George being gay and closeted was concerned. So George has just confronted Barb with this diatribe, this lengthy, caps-locked, brutal speech about his father just brutally beating him up. I'm just coming back to brutal because it's such a painful thing. It's so violent and so vicious in this moment. And George is dealing with this trauma that he has. And Barb, it says in the stage directions, Barb is unable to speak, but she looks at Latifah and exits. And then we get this interaction between George and Latifah. And George says, "We were on my bed, and you looked at me in this way that seared my soul. And I put my hand on your cheek, and I rested my head on yours. My heart was..." This was before he was beaten by his father, by the way. "My heart was beating so fast I couldn't stop feeling it thump against my chest. I just wanted to breathe you, be right there with you and breathe you in. I didn't even know that I started to kiss you until everything else just stopped moving." Latifah says, George says, "And it felt like a lifetime, and it felt like a second. And I pulled away to look at the door. I was so scared someone would catch us, but I didn't want to stop." Latifah says, "You were shaking so bad." George says, "Until you held me and everything just became us. We weren't in this town, we weren't hurting, we were just..." "And you looked right up at me and you asked me," Latifah says, "if you were sure." George says, "I couldn't speak, but I unbuttoned my shirt and then yours. I took off everything, not just my clothes, not just yours, but everything." Latifah says, "We were standing there, a heartbeat from each other, nothing between us." George says, "And I stopped looking at the door." Latifah says, "And you stopped stopping yourself." George says, "And I let go." Latifah says, "And your hands." George says, "Your skin." Latifah says, "It didn't matter that we didn't know what we were doing. For the first time," George says, "we weren't scared. We were really fucking happy." Latifah says, "But only for a moment." And George says, "I've lived in that moment for a lifetime." I think it's such a beautiful fucking passage. I mean, I think, amazingly written. And then immediately it turns. And this is, I think, part of the genius of this play. There's so much complexity. I'm not even going to get to talk about a fraction of what deserves to be talked about because there's so much complexity in this play. Because the next line after what the stage directions describe as a heavy beat is George says, "He caught us." And we had earlier in the play gotten this heartbreaking scene where after they had sex for the first time, after this beautiful moment between them, Latif had gone home. Latif's father threw them out of the house, came back to George, and after pounding on the door, begging George to be let in, George opened the door and just beat Latif severely, yelling homophobic slurs. It was a heartbreaking scene, but what we learn later in the play, after this beautiful passage that I'd read, is that George's memory of his father beating him severely was from that day. George's father had caught them. He was sent home from work for being drunk. He caught them. He beat George severely, and George beat Latif both out of fear of what his father would do to him, to George, if he didn't break it off, but also out of fear of what his father would do to Latif. I mean, and it's this heartbreaking moment. I mean, and George blames himself. He recognizes that as much as he, on some level, beat up Latif and drove Latif out of this town because he was scared of what his father would do, and his father might murder Latif. George also knows that he made that choice. He says, I destroyed us, not him. I did. He was just watching out for me. It was discipline because he loved me and he wanted me to be a better man. Latif says, no. He taught you that was love. He taught you that was how to express yourself, what you're feeling. He taught you to hide it, but you're smarter than that. You're stronger than that. He had muscles the size of your truck, but he was the weakest man I ever knew. Your power, your strength, it comes from this. She holds George's head gently with her hands. It's a tender action. She says, and this. She moves her hands to his chest above his heart. That's what makes you a man. And I think the thing that is in some ways most amazing about the play is that it's not a story of forgiveness. Latifah is forever damaged, forever hurt, forever traumatized by what George did. The betrayal and the brutality of the emotional damage more than the physical pain. And Latifah can understand why George did what he did. She can understand how he feels, but that doesn't make it okay. And that's what I think is ultimately beautiful and heartbreaking about this play. It's a play in which people do things that are detrimental to others. And often you can come to understand them. But that doesn't mean that the damage is not there. It helps. It can be cathartic. And I deeply, truly believe this. It can be cathartic to understand what motivated someone to do something that has hurt you. But it doesn't make it okay. It doesn't make the hurt go away. I think this play is one of the best, most amazingly beautiful, most amazingly heartbreaking expressions of that idea that I've ever encountered. I could not recommend it more highly.